So we begin this morning with a returning McCain speaker who always challenges the audience and provides us with new insights and perspectives. Major General Charlie Dunlap is the executive director of the Center on Law, Ethics, and National Security at the Duke Law School. Prior to retiring from the military and joining Duke, he assisted in the supervision of more than 2,500 military and civilian attorneys worldwide. And of course, anyone who can supervise that many lawyers deserves our admiration and respect. General Dunlap is the author of more than 100 publications and speaks frequently on a wide variety of topics, including law of armed conflict issues, cyber war, drones, civil-military relations, ethics, military justice, and a phenomena he calls lawfare. He serves on the board of advisors for A New American Security and the Foreign Policy Research. General Dunlap received his undergraduate degree from St. Joseph's University and his law degree from Villanova University. He is also a distinguished graduate of the National War College. Please join me in welcoming General Dunlap.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be back here. This is the premier conference on this subject, and it never fails to provide a lot of intellectual infrastructure stimulation for many things coming in the future. What I'm going to talk about this morning, and I really do want to thank Kathy for helping me with my slides. If anything goes wrong, it's my fault. If it goes right, it's all because of her. And it's great to see so many old friends and to make some new friends. And I'm really thrilled to see the midshipmen here because that really is the next generation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about an article that I wrote almost 25 years ago. It's called The Origins of the American Military Coup of 2012. And interestingly enough, I'm going to talk about some reflections on it. Before Ed asked me to do this, I really hadn't read it for years. And I went back and read it, and I thought, some things I got very well and other things not so well, and we'll go through that. I think academics might appreciate this. You know how you write some things and you put a lot of work into it, and lo and behold, an innocent tree dies to print it, and nobody ever reads it, not even your mother. And so, but then there are other things that really seem to catch on. And this I wrote when I was in War College, and it really was good for me. I ended up as a co-winner met Colin Powell, really amazing guy. Okay, he did a million of these award ceremonies. He talks to you for about 2 minutes. Then he goes to the ceremony, and it's like you know him for 20 years. He knew everything about the paper. He knew things about me. He worked it into this presentation. All my relatives think we were drinking buddies, and I can allow that probably didn't happen. But one of the fun things that resulted was I ended up working on a movie. I wish I could tell you it was based on the article, but I ended up being what's called a script doctor, and during the Q&A we can talk about some of the adventures I had in Hollywood working on that film, because I do think that they illustrate civil-military relations. And let me just tell you one story from that. Okay, it was an HBO movie, and we're going to this meeting with the actors and actresses and so forth, and we're walking down the hallway, and 2 secretaries were behind me, and they told a dirty joke. And the guy who's head of HBO Pictures kind of glares at them and then go on, and then afterwards they say, Colonel, we'd like to speak with you. And I'm thinking, holy God, what's this? Go into the office, sit down, and they said, on behalf of HBO Pictures, remember, I'd just gotten back from the Somalia operation where I was attached to the Marine Corps at this point. We know that you officers and gentlemen aren't used to that language being used in your presence. And I go, yeah, I'm really insulted. And they go, yes, well, we can understand that, and we want you to know that we've taken. I said, no, seriously. And there's more stories like that, but let's try to take a look at. And this is the strange thing. When you go to Duke, they put all your publications into this database. And this started in 2010. And so I'm thinking, oh gosh, oh my good, recent stuff is really going to be out there. No, actually, the second most downloaded thing is this article from 25 years ago. And I actually did kind of an academic version of it 2 years later. Of course, this poor thing, has 10% of the downloads. So there's something about when you're trying to access an audience, you need to think through how you might optimally do that. And that's why I use the fictional scenario. People ask me, well, why'd you do that? Well, partly because getting something at that time cleared for release, if it was fictional, it was much easier to clear it for release, strangely. I don't think that's the case now, so don't go to the bank on that. But also, I was trying to think how I would catch attention. I thought, what's the most unlikely thing that people would ever think about the U.S. military? And I thought, oh, coup. Okay, I'll talk about a coup, and that'll get people to read the article. Because what I had been doing, and just so you know, I never really thought that there would be a coup of 2012. I was using it as a literary device. But you'd be surprised how often I've been contacted in the last quarter century about why, is my coup really going to take place in 10 years, 5 years, yesterday, or whatever. And really, what I had done, and maybe for some of the students here, is I collected things that I saw in the paper. We used to have a clipping service called the Early Bird. Now it exists electronically, which is better. And I put together all these things that ticked me off. And I tried to come up with a unifying theme, so I worked a lot of those into the paper. Some of the things about the scenario actually did come true. Our enemy in my scenario 25 years ago was Iran. And I would say today, maybe enemy is not exactly right, but not friend. And I also was really concerned about non-traditional missions for the military because I very much thought that they would draw attention away from what needed to have attention, which is what Elliot talked about yesterday, focusing on war fighting. And I wrote a follow-up with more detail about what I was concerned with. But as we know, the entire counterinsurgency strategy was built upon a concept of of military people doing non-traditional things. I very much thought that was the wrong strategy. I wrote a 120-page this is a good example, something that killed innocent trees, rebuttal to it. But the fact of the matter is, in the coming years, we saw the military deployed for Katrina, and at that time, there was a lot of discussion that the military ought to be the force of first recourse in a disaster. I think that would not have been a good idea. But we have seen over the years the military getting more and more involved in various domestic activities. I think a lot because of the rise of terrorism. Additionally, we've seen the importation of things from the battlefield into the domestic world. We've seen a lot about drones, but also that other article where they're using counterinsurgency techniques against gangs. And I think that's a little bit problematic when you think about it. Is this a good or bad thing for civil-military relations? I'll let you, we can talk about that later. And this, I think, we mentioned it yesterday. I think it's very important. I am of the belief that a lot of this goes back to people of a certain age may remember in Los Angeles. Remember the famous bank robbery where the cops were outgunned? And there's a YouTube video of it, and they went on. The robbers had, vests on, and they had automatic weapons, and the cops had to borrow guns from a gun store because all they had was their .38s. I think that's a big part of the militarization of the police. But I also think we ended up with kind of an arms race between the criminals and the police. And I do think that the police saw, they began to ape the military in a lot of ways. And so I think that's something, and there's been a lot written about this, the end state being too much aggressive force by police. I'm not sure if that's really true, but I think it can be traced. It has a military origin to it. I wrote about this, and I anticipated that we might have a catastrophic terrorism event. And interestingly enough, Bill Banks up at Syracuse has just written a book called Soldiers on the Home Front. And he points out there, he talks about a catastrophic cyber event that might might put the military in a position of having to do things that would not be traditionally acceptable. But he talks about the ability of modern terrorists to really cause catastrophic incidents, which would require the deployment of the armed forces in a sort of a martial law situation. And I was very concerned about the risk to military effectiveness, and I'm going to come back to this later at the end of the presentation, because I think it's affecting military morale as well as how people view the military. Today, the military is popular, even more popular back then, but the military has pretty much sustained its popularity. And is this a cause of concern? Let's think about this, because the institutions of civilian control the public has repeatedly, and this isn't recent, has found that they have much less confidence in the institutions of civilian control than they do in the military itself. And there's another poll from 2013 that kind of surprisingly, to me anyway, because when the poll came out in December 2013, it was after there was a lot of scandals among senior officers. It found that officers, the honesty and ethics of officers was second only to physicians and I think nurses, and I think elementary school teachers. But other than those groups, the military officers rated the highest. Is that always a good thing? But do people really understand the military? 71% of the people, and this poll's a few years old, indicated that no, they really don't know much about the military, yet it's the institution that they have the most confidence in. And I think this is also very interesting. Some of you might have seen this poll where a surprising number of Americans believe that torture of prisoners is okay, except that, you've heard that before, except that this poll was about if American soldiers were captured. Look at the percentage of people that think that torture of them is acceptable. I think that's very remarkable, and I think more indicative of people just don't know what they're talking about when it comes to the military. Now, more recently, we've had a lot of discussion about the use of torture. In fact, we had it here with General Pace. And I think it is interesting to at least acknowledge that most Americans today, very significant percentage of Americans today, would say that torture is sometimes permissible. And, we've had a presidential candidate talk about that, and lots of people rather sanctimoniously have said that the military won't obey those orders. We would hope not, but I've written a blog post about this, and it's hard. I can't come up with an example, honestly, and maybe during the Q&A somebody will educate me, of where the military disobeyed an order of the president. But there are lots of examples where the military obeyed an illegal order of the president, starting with Lincoln. Well, probably starting before that, but Lincoln, Roosevelt, Kennedy, and so forth. So there's lots of counterexamples. So Rosa Brooks has written an interesting article where she says, don't count on the military to be disobeying orders if someone's elected. You better elect the right person if you're concerned about that. This I find fascinating. It is a little bit dated, but a lot of people, I think this is a reflection that, obviously the majority didn't hold this view, but it's significant that 28% held this view, that people don't really understand civil-military relations or the purpose behind it. And I think that's something we need to contemplate as we look forward. I came up with in the original 2012 article a couple of recommendations, and I thought I'd run through them real quickly. This is, a lot of you know Greg Foster. This is a very interesting article. In any event, I had this idea that the military had to focus on killing people and breaking things. He has a very different recommendation. He wants the military to concentrate on everything but that. And we may not agree with that, but what today is indisputably a military duty. And I go back again to what we were talking about before, which is cyber. I think cyber is going to present a civil military challenge for us because it so involves the domestic and the international. And General Barno just literally earlier this week wrote an article where he talks about this and how it's broken down the borders. And I think it's going to change the relationship because the armed forces is the military, the NSA, is the one that has the expertise. So inevitably, we are going to be involved with domestic. And the history of the military being involved with domestic matters, especially domestic law enforcement, is not very encouraging for those interested in a democracy. And there is some confusion out there as to who is in charge and what the rules are. And recently, there's been a little bit of a change in policy because originally the military's cyber interest was just to protect the military. And now, almost by necessity, you're seeing it evolve into something more, protecting the key parts of the infrastructure. And I really do think that we're going to have to sort this out to make sure that the equities, the asymmetric advantage that the military can bring to bear doesn't start intruding into things that the public is interested in. And we only have to take a look, and Phil Carter and I were talking about this, the Apple case and all the dispute with the Apple and the FBI. If we get in that kind of dispute with the American people, that is not going to be good for civil-military relations. I never liked the idea that everything's a war on this and everything's a war on that. One thing that Jim Fallows wrote in his 1991 article that became so famous on national defense, he said that the way you get things done in this country is to call it a national security threat and then bring the military to bear. And he, at that time, points out that's how the interstate highway system was built. Well, today we see the same thing. I think Admiral Mullen was very ill-advised to make this statement. Number one, he's unqualified to state it. And number two, his solution to it was to, cut back on the military budget. I don't think he's enough of an economist to do that. I think he was way out of his lane. Wonderful human being, great officer, but I think on this particular instance, it was not a wise thing to do. More recently, we found out, well, our mission now is, climate change. That's now a new mission. Exactly what we're supposed to do about it. How do we stay out of, if the economy and climate change are things that the military is supposed to address, won't that inevitably bring them in conflict with civilian authorities and the political system, if we're supposed to solve that problem? Redeploying budgetary resources. When I wrote the original article, I didn't like the Navy doing drug patrols in the Gulf because I thought it would diminish their warfighting ability, because going after drug dealers is not the same thing with going after what was then the Soviet Navy. A little bit different now with the threat of terrorism. But I am glad to see the Coast Guard, and I certainly hope the Merchant Marine is in the same category in getting more resources, because they really do have the expertise. And we ought to allocate budgetary resources where the expertise lies. I was concerned about lots of things are in the defense budget. You always hear, oh my God, the United States has a bigger budget than the next 15 people, 15 countries or whatever. Well, most other countries do not have medical care for the dependents of their retirees in their military budget. And lots of them have separate intelligence budgets. And there's lots of, some of the, Duke, for example, has $55 million in DoD contracts, mostly in the medical center to do. That's not the way other countries do it. And other countries don't pay a living wage to their troops either. So I do think we need to try to get some clarity with what we're spending so that the public has a better idea of the money. It's still a tremendous amount of money, but the fact of the matter is a lot of it, to the extent that there is waste, it's not because people like to talk about the DoD wasting money, and the DoD does waste money, but Congress doesn't help them when they're driven by things other than national security interest. And in any event, as we can see, the defense budget is declining, so there are fewer resources to spread around, which means that that which we do have is very precious to us. This was probably the thing that if I could change, I probably would change, because I went after the Guard really hard in this, because at that time, I didn't believe that the Guard was really adding value, and my own experience with them was it was all about jobs. It wasn't really about supporting the mission. And I think I would have to say I'm wrong about that in a lot of ways, because the Guard now really is like the active force. That's the good news. The bad news is the Guard really is like the active force, with one big exception that I'm going to talk about. And the Guard's finding themselves doing non-traditional missions. What is the Guard doing guarding the border in state status? And I also think that one of the challenges that we have is that when people look at a Guardsman, they don't know, and it says U.S. Army on there, they don't know the difference between someone in state status and someone in federalized status. And so there are lots of things that a Guardsman can do in his state status, including law enforcement, that an active duty military person can't. And I think that and I'm going to show you one area where it really is affecting us in a negative way. A lot has to do, many of you know the Air Force of late has had a real battle with the Guard over the retirement of the A-10. The Guard won, and the Guard is going to continue to win. Because here, you might remember, these are the F-22 pilots in the Guard who won it on TV after being ordered not to wear their uniforms. They did it anyway, and they basically got away with it. There were some mixed views of that, but the fact of the matter is, they're in a different legal status, and they can do overt political things. And the fact of the matter is, they are unapologetic about being partisan and political. And the thing about that is, I think it's bleeding over into the active duty force, because the active duty force is very vulnerable to these kind of political machinations. This is from a few years ago, talking about in the budget. And I think John McCain, I think there's a quote from him down here, never underestimate the influence of the Guard. So you can't have a highly politicized entity, which is now, I think, your functional equivalent in terms of their ability to do the mission, because I think it's now infecting the rest of the force with the politicization, which I think ultimately will be unhealthy. And I don't have any bright ideas on how to do it, except that, the Navy doesn't have this problem, but the Army and the Air Force, it's a very serious problem, because, we need the Guard, we need a reserve force, but how do we build an architecture so that the politicization doesn't become a tool that then the active force tries to match in some way? I also talked about, when I talked about this in the original article, I was more concerned about people thinking, oh, the military doesn't have anything to do, ergo, we will start giving them new duties. And that was happening in the early 90s. They were talking about putting troops in the schools. They wanted to deploy troops to Southeast Washington. They wanted to do all kinds of things with the military. But today, I guess we do need to explain ourselves a little bit more, because do you remember last summer this Jade Helm thing? Oh yeah. Special Forces had this 17-state exercise where I always used to wonder when I was in the military and we do an exercise, it was always country blue and it was just this blob, and country red. I'm thinking, why don't we use real countries? Well, Here's the reason: because they used real states, and they decided Texas was going to be the most dangerous state, and they put it all in red and said, somebody got those slides, and it became a real issue. And the Texas governor ended up deploying the Texas State Guard, which, there's the National Guard, but then there's the State Defense Forces, which are military forces under the command of but they're not part of the National Guard of the U.S., to watch special forces to make sure that they weren't going to take over Texas and so forth. And it's kind of funny, but evidently a lot of people took it quite seriously, and I think it illustrates lots of things about civil-military relations, including that there is a latent anti-militarism out there that I'll talk about, and it's not just in the media or among elites, but also that people really don't know what it takes to have a fully functional force in the 21st century. Talked about unification. That was one of the big things in the paper. It obviously hasn't happened. In fact, I would say we are less joint now than we were in the early 90s. We're moving in the opposite direction. And one observation I would make, and I think I'm correct about this, is way back when we used to have the same desert BDUs or desert uniforms. Now everybody is going to separate uniforms, each service. So I don't see jointness having a bright future. Now, one of the things that General Pace talked about yesterday is one of the proposals that General Brutus, who was the bad guy in my Coup of 2012 paper, one of the things that there is some discussion, and this was in the paper, that Congress passed a statute making General Brutus the commander of all forces. Well, lo and behold, 25 years later, people are actually talking about that. Now, the DOD, for their part, they don't want that, but they do want to enhance the power of the chairman, among other changes. At this time, I was concerned that the academies were too much dominating the officer corps. What do you think about that, midshipman? Academies dominating the officer corps too much? And because ROTC was dying on the campuses. Well, lo and behold, ROTC has recovered. And in fact, it's providing 70% of the officer corps. And it has a lot to do with the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We're seeing it come back on campuses. But before we get too excited about it, I think we're just seeing the very tip of a changing attitude from acceptance to hostility on campuses. And a couple examples, and I thought I don't know this guy, but he writes some pretty interesting stuff. I'm going to come back to him later. But he wrote an article, he's in the Army ROTC at Harvard, and the thing that struck me is, okay, they got Army ROTC back at Harvard, but there's only 6 people in the unit. Okay, I guess maybe 6 is better than 0, but I think that is interesting and not what I thought. And this you might have seen very recently. Anybody heard about this, General Eikenberry? Yeah, they don't want him because he was a general. Forget that he was an ambassador, and the official reason, well, he doesn't have a PhD. Okay, he has like 40 years experience doing what they say they're training people to do, but because he has that's the official, it's just, I think, hostility. We're seeing the re-empowerment of military entities, including, and you'll see it first in academia and the press. I was concerned about that we weren't going out and tapping everybody. That concern is still here, but I think it's very interesting. Here we have 70% of the American youth can't even qualify to get into the military. I think that's a terrible situation. So forget about trying to have all parts of society. If 70% of society can't serve anyway, that I think is a real, more than civil-military relations problem. I think it's a problem of national security. The base is an island. I was concerned back then that we were getting too much, this is part of the isolation. And I do think that we have seen that I think the military is in a lot of ways isolated, even though a much smaller percentage of people actually live on base. But they may not live on base, but they live in military-dominated communities. So it's not base, but it's practically base. Very recent article about a situation at Fort Bragg. And I do think that this is a phenomenon that Secretary Gates talked about when he came down and spoke at Duke. I never realized this, that it's just 5 states that have significant military installations anymore. And that, I think, has potential for civil-military relations because people just aren't going to know people. And if they do know somebody, it's likely somebody in the Guard, and the Guard in this respect is different from the active force. You can see where the people are enlisting from. This is from Jim Fallows' article in The Atlantic. I think it's interesting. I wish I put up there the one where casualties are, because casualties aren't exactly the same. Casualties, if you see per 100,000 people, casualties are more on the coast, from the coast. I'm not quite sure why that is or how that is, but that's the way it is. I think, General Barno and General Eikenberry wrote this, and I think there actually is data out on this now that in the all-volunteer force, there is a very high percentage of people who, for whom it is a family business, and either they have a close relative who is in the armed forces, even though only 24% of the American population is either a veteran or serving. So, but something like 70% of people in the military have some close relative who is in the armed forces. So I think, this is the concern. Are we building a military case, whatever that word, you guys know where I'm struggling with. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing because I do think in a democracy that having all echelons of society represented is in and of itself a value. Thinking about the future. So those are some things I talked about, the recommendations, and here's some things I've been thinking about as I reflect back on that circumstance, that paper. I think, we talk about, well, let's keep the military out of politics. How do you do that? I mean, because everything has politics. A couple of years ago, I noticed this. They're talking about the defense budget, and the New York Times put it in the politics section. So, and you think about Clausewitz. What does Clausewitz tell us about war as an extension of politics by other means? I am not sure if you can really stay out of things having a political dimension, and whether you can really cordon off that part. Very difficult. I think that I read this review of American Sniper, and he reflects on the civil-military relations aspect of the American soldier, and he says that the American soldier is a political actor because it is such an icon in American society, even though, as we know from before, the American people really don't know what they're iconing. They have an idea, but it may not be reflective of what it really is. General McFarland, I have no idea what was in his head when he decided to answer this question from, a reporter. And on top of everything else, he got almost everything wrong about what he said. He apparently doesn't know about area bombardment. He doesn't know about H&I fire. He doesn't know about what CENTCOM is calling their current bombing campaign against oil facilities. They're calling it Operation Tidal Wave 2. You know what Tidal Wave 1 was? Tidal Wave 1 was when we carpet bombed the Romanian oil facilities during World War II. And in the release that CENTCOM had last December, they said, yes, the bombing is like a tidal wave going across the oil fields. Well, yeah, actually, you can carpet bomb. You can't carpet bomb civilians, but I mean, we do area bombardment from time to time, and we're finding even non-traditional adversaries will sometimes present those kinds of targets. But the real point here is, why even get into that? And because you earn headlines like this. But, you know, it's hard to be on all the time, even when you're a 3-star or 4-star. I think the military, I think this was the right message to go out. I think they're doing the best they can to stay out of the political arena, but how much success they'll have, because I'm sure there'll be other General McFarlands as this political campaign goes on. I think this is a real problem. And when I faced myself, this was during the military commissions. So I had this wild idea that, you know, hey, maybe the accused ought to be able to see the evidence. And that was not what the administration wanted at the time. And we had to testify, and I found out, I think Ms. Hicks yesterday was giving you the tip of the iceberg. When you testify before Congress, you get told what you're supposed to say. And until they ask you your personal opinion, then you can give your personal opinion. So and we don't really have a good system here. And as you go through the years, there's been these different issues that have come up, especially against senior officers, you know, speaking out or seeming to speak out. I think, you know, when we reflect back on this situation, it wasn't, you know, the DoD IG cleared General McChrystal, but just I think it's difficult when someone goes from an environment where everything is classified and it's super secret and nobody ever talks about anything outside the room, into an environment being a 4-star where you have a reporter with you all the time. You know, that is an evolution that senior officers are going to have to learn to understand, that it's very, very different than what they might have understood before. Of course, the situation with General Moseley and Secretary Wynne, you know, I don't think anybody, at least in the Air Force, believes that they are fired because some contractor, you know, put a part of a nose cone into a box and sent it to Taiwan. It was really about the F-22. You know, and ironically, with the benefit of 20/20 hindsight, they were right. We should have continued to build the F-22, especially the way the F-35 has worked out. We do need a 5th-generation fighter like the F-22. And when Secretary Gates went to China right towards the end of his, and they flew the Chinese J-20, right when he was there, after he said that they were years away from doing it, you know, he was a man who could never admit that he was ever wrong about something. And I think that's part of it. But be that as it may, it shows you that even at this level, even at something that really is military, and even including a political appointee, you know, candor isn't appreciated. And so I think this is the point that I would suggest that General Pace was getting at. You know, unfortunately got tied up in the lawful, unlawful order thing yesterday. But what he's really saying is that sometimes you have to do the right thing and accept the consequences. Because I'm here to tell you that doing the right thing doesn't mean it's going to work out in the end. That's why I always tell my students, have plan B. Have plan B, because you might find yourself where you're going to have to do the right thing, you're going to pay a penalty for, and you're never going to be vindicated. I've seen it over and over and over again in the military, and I think there are people in this room who know exactly what I'm talking about and have seen that happen, but you still have to do the right thing. And there continues to be these things. Now, one of the complicating factors, there was some discussion about Colonel Yingling. He, strangely enough, got out of the service. You know, I don't know his situation, but gosh, if you don't stay around to fix the problem, I don't know. Anyway, in his famous article, he made a couple of points, but he wanted generals to be speaking out publicly. And so I think there's a certain expectation among subordinates. And this is a formula for civil-military relations problems, I would say. I've written a couple articles trying to try to provide guidelines of when you speak out, when you're not, and I've come to the conclusion that, as Ms. Hicks said yesterday, you can do things around the margins, but at the end of the day, there really is no fully, clear way of expressing dissent without, consequences, even when you testify. And so I think that there is a lot of problems, not only with active duty, but with retired officers, and we haven't sorted this out. Some of you might be aware of the controversy between General Scales and General Barno that played out in the op-ed pages of the Washington Post. The thing that I disagree with General Scales about, and he is a friend of mine, he presented himself as if he was speaking for active duty. Let's go back and take a look at that. And I asked him about this. He said, "Oh yeah, I talked to a lot of my friends in the Army." I said, "Well, there's the Air Force and the Navy, the Coast Guard. I mean, how many people did you talk?" He said, "Oh well, he doesn't know." Now, and so I think it's very wrong when a retired officer represents speaking for the active duty force, because it suggests that there are surrogates out there, and sometimes maybe there are. General Barno went after him pretty sharply. I don't think they're drinking buddies anymore. I don't want to speak for them, but it was a pretty sharp difference of opinion that they had, and I have to come down with General Barno on this one. I like the idea that General Scales presents his views, but they're his views. I do think that the public does know the difference between active duty and retired officers, because otherwise I think would have had a President Wesley Clark maybe or something. They knew when he became a politician, he's treated as a politician. But when people purport to speak for the active duty force, but I think it's changing, and I think General Flynn is just one example of the different views that we're seeing as to what role a retired officer will have. And I think in Sean Naylor in this article, I think, he lays out what the issue is pretty clearly, and I think General Flynn knows what the issue, and there are I use him as just one example. And shoot, I write stuff myself. I'm in Time magazine this morning. I just got an email on something I said. Not sure no, I'm fine with what I said, but I really think collective action, this is why I personally never sign any kind of letter or things like that, because if you're a retired officer, it's one thing to express your own view, but it's another thing to do some kind of collective action. It almost smacks of, I don't know. Collective action has always been a negative thing in the military in terms of, expressing dissent. And, we're not getting a good example from our civilian counterparts, I would say, in this department, because there is no ethic. It does surprise me that even for civilians, when the person that you are serving is still in office, that you're writing these tell-all kinds of books, but that's the way it is. I think social media is really going to impact civil-military relations, because it's giving people in the armed forces access, and one way it's a good thing, because then people maybe will get to know people in the military more, but it is fraught with a lot of dangers. Remember this Marine sergeant from a couple years ago? Gates had a kind of interesting observation in his memoir. I was a little surprised at this, because he likes to think of himself as very forward-looking, and I think this is really dating himself in a way. But maybe he has a point. I think we need to think through, does this, if a general or an admiral tweets to people, is that taken away from his aura? We've seen all kinds of things that technology has brought about that have the potential to impact civil-military relations. And I think this is, you might remember this, this particular general got in trouble later for other things, but he had gone to a funeral for somebody who had committed suicide, and he tweeted out something negative about the individual, and he was reacting to the frustration and so forth. That's why I think if you're going to have one of these accounts, you need to be very careful about what and how you do it. But lots of generals have them. They're very proud of them. And I think it has the potential to have some real impact on civil-military relations. This is something that I wanted to get back to. I'm using Dr. Foster again. I don't want you to think I agree with it. His article is very bitter, very caustic. Caustic, I think, is the better way of describing it, about the military. But he does make this point. And his solution is, don't have the military fight wars because they're not very good at it. And I do think it's having, an effect. This is Williams again, because the American people do think that we failed in Iraq and Afghanistan, and understandably so. Right now, they are not yet blaming the military. I think that's a shoe waiting to fall, actually. But we also have heard a lot about morale in the military is going down, and there's this very extensive article in the Military Times and showing the differences between just a few years ago and 2014. And one of the reasons that has been pointed out is the troops don't feel like they were successful. And I think that does have something to do. This is very interesting. This guy, Raphael Cohen, is a former Army officer, I think. He's really written some interesting stuff. And, and what he makes the point is it's really not about the pay or the benefits and all these other kinds of cuts, but it's the way you think of yourself and the organization that you're a part of. And I think that someday the public may, right now they separate the soldier from the circumstance in which the soldier functioned, in other words, the operation, the lack of operational success. But I don't know how that's going to affect their view. And Hugh Strachan, a lot of you know him, very famous historian, has made this point that, it has not yet emerged. We're starting to see a little bit of it now. I know in the debate over rules of engagement, every time I talk to somebody, because we're now loosening our rules of engagement, but before we had rules of engagement that were much more restrictive than what international law would require, for example. And people say, hey, we know it's bad and we know it's wrong, but it's the politicians who want it. I don't know about that. Politicians are only as good as the military advice they get. And in any event, I think that we may see a different view coming out. I think they have. I think the mindset has changed. And, I think that there is more of, across the ranks, not just the senior ranks, but across the ranks, more of not just disposition, but obligation to speak out. And this came up, and I think has a lot to do with the kind of wars that we have fought for the last 15 years. And this is the article that I referenced yesterday with General Pace. I really do encourage you to read two things. One, read the article, but then read Dick Cohn's rebuttal. Because we can't have a military where everybody's personal moral code, they decide if they're going to obey this order or that order. For example, if you get an order that says, these are the restrictive rules of engagement that you have, and you decide, my moral code is my troops are going to be endangered by this, so I'm going to break the rules of engagement. General Lavelle, an interesting new monograph has come out about that whole incident. Learned that the hard way during Vietnam. In addition, but I think that the nature of counterinsurgency warfare, when you send a captain, meaning 03, Army captain or a Navy lieutenant, into a counterinsurgency situation, and the book I recommend is The Outpost by Jake Tapper. If you want to know what young people, the position that this country put them in, I think that's a good example. But there's a book from the Vietnam era is called Once a Warrior King. Has anybody ever read that? Where you put these young men, mainly actually, out in these and they responsible for everything, from fixing a village water system to running the political system to the educational system. You can't have them do that and then come back and say, okay, you're going to be in charge of the motor pool. That's not going to work. And I think that is a challenge that we're going to have with our military. Changing ethic. Really. And I'm going to get back to this because I think it has something to do with people looking at the military, even those in the military, as a job. I think we've a little bit lost the idea of a profession, and ergo, you conduct yourself more like a civilian than you do as a member of a special. More's to come out on the way those sailors conducted themselves who were captured by the Iranians, but wow. Easy for me to stand up here not in their position, but I am surprised with the way they conducted themselves. And I want to know more about why that was. But I don't think it represents a military ethic, at least as much as I know, and I want to be educated. I think we're seeing the re-legitimization of anti-militarism. We're seeing, this was down in Durham. I thought, wow, people are going to come loose about this. They didn't. It was like, they vandalized a military facility, no big deal. But more recently, and I also think, and this is what I was getting at with Jim yesterday, I think that in the media, there's been this suppressed hostility towards the military, that they are only now feeling empowered that they can get back to. And you see it, look where the media is compared to the military. They don't like that. I've heard a lot of journalists say, we've risked our lives, we do that, nobody cares. And I think there's a little bit of jealousy in terms of the military. So these are just from this week. You see that USA Today article, which is completely wrong. Number one, how do they know, just quick segue into the law, okay, a civilian under international law gets to be a civilian regardless of whether they're legally or morally culpable. In other words, they don't have to be innocent. They just have to not participate directly enough in hostilities to lose their status as civilians. So they don't know whether they're innocent or not. And I would suggest that most of the people who are collateral damage in these attacks, they are legally civilians, they're protected by international law, but don't tell me they're innocents. There was a great article written by the former Librarian of Congress, Borstein, what was his first name? About the Serbs. He said it's called the myth of popular innocence. He said Americans like to believe that, enemy populations are the captive of these horrible leaders. And he pointed out, hey, there were millions of Serbs who were very supportive of killing off the Muslims. It's not like that. But in any event, the implication that our military is killing innocent people, and as you read through the article, nowhere does he say that what the law actually is, or explains that. Nobody is suggesting breaking international law, for example. The other one is from New York Times, yesterday, I guess. Typical, I've learned that if you ever want to find out what is the reason people don't trust the papers, read New York Times op-eds, because they're almost, the ones that I read in my area, they almost always have some significant error in them. But one of the things I talked about here is, well, we're not paying the victims enough money. That's culturally, they don't, it's not because we don't want to pay money, but sometimes if you give victims $100,000, then they become targets and so forth. There's very much of a complex thing. But the real point here is they feel empowered to criticize the military. And one of the things that nobody has stood up for when this incident happened, the Kunduz bombing, and it was a screw up, no question about it, but you know, Doctors Without Borders, because of their internal politics, would not put a red cross on their building. It wasn't marked. Unless you can figure out what their little symbol is, which is kind of a running man sort of thing. So it didn't have the big red crosses on it, and that's because they split off from the International Committee of the Red Cross years ago because of political differences. But nobody, immediately they declared a war crime had been committed before any investigation was done. I didn't see one human rights organization, not one, stand up and say, well, you know, they are entitled to the presumption of innocence. Those young men and women on that gunship, they are entitled to due process. The same people that want us, as we should, give everything to Guantanamo detainees who are declaring themselves enemies of the United States. We're doing everything for them. No human rights organization, to their shame, said one word about Doctors Without Borders declaring an outcome before the investigation was done. No one stood up for the members of the United States Armed Forces who were doing the best they could under circumstances. Mistakes obviously were made, lessons will be learned, but war crime, that's a whole different ballgame. I'll get off the expertise of civilian leaders, and then I do want to open up for some Q&A. We all know this. Members of Congress, fewer and fewer. I have mixed feelings about this because the period that we had one of the highest percentages of veterans in Congress was when? Vietnam War. That didn't work out so good. So it's not like there's necessarily going to be strategic expertise. Lots of, now very recently we got this report, hundreds in a country where we have tens of thousands of elective offices, hundreds is not too significant, but I also wonder who's being elected. I think there are a lot of, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, and that's good, but they have a certain view of warfare, the only view of warfare that they have, and that's not the warfare that we need, in my judgment, need to be most concerned about now, looking ahead to threats from China, Russia, and so forth. So, now one of the things, General Dempsey gave a speech down at Duke, said that, because it came up, we're not going to have a president in the near term who is a veteran. Does that matter? And what do we do about all these civilians who don't know anything about the military? And he made an observation. He said that the best background for a civilian leader is to do something in leadership. He said, but he makes the point, it doesn't necessarily have to be having served in the military. It might be, in some organization, a church group or something. He said that he thinks the most important thing for civilians who are going to be leaders in the Defense Department, defense establishment, is they need to learn leadership, and that's what's hard to do. And the final thing I wanted to mention was my biggest concern as we look forward is that the military will become another interest group. Right now it enjoys a special status. And I would suggest perhaps a too exalted status for the good of a democracy. It needs to be respected. If we're going to have an all-volunteer force, you have to be a very highly respected organization if you're going to continue to attract the best and brightest. But I don't want to see the military becoming just another interest group. And the ability now to communicate every bad feeling, every negative about the military, and then defending yourself through this ubiquitous communication system, that combined with sheer exhaustion from the wars in the public's mind, and then increasing frustration, the burden of the defense budget, I think that we're at risk of having the military considered another interest group. And we've seen that when an organization becomes just an interest group, that's not a good thing for it. And I think that has the potential to increase the tension of the civil-military relations concept. And I've always thought that civil-military relations was always about not so much a real coup, but when the military would get, untoward influence in government. And I guess there is another side to it. It's when the military will not have enough influence in government. There is a balance there, because if military interests aren't understood and taken into account, doesn't mean followed, because civilians really do need to have the final say. And I think that as we look out today, there is a yearning among the American people to have something work in government. And right now, they are still looking at the military as the most effective organization. They're still blaming the civilian leaders, but that could change, at which time our relationship, meaning the military's relationship with the people they serve, could change. And my bottom line is, I think we face an uncertain future. I am not going to stand up here and say, like Dick Cohn actually didn't say it, that we have a crisis in civil-military relations. Some editor put that title on his article. But I think that I am not as sanguine about civil-military relations as I want to be. And I don't think we should be either. At the same time, we're not on the edge of having a coup. But I think that there are too many unsettled things about the relationship that need to be sorted out, that we have to look forward to in the future. With that, I think we do have some time for Q&A. Yes, sir.
John, I'm Colin Agee from RMG2. First thing I want to say is I read your paper when it first came out, and I can't tell you how many times I've come back to that over the years. So,
Thank you.
The question I wanted to ask, though, when you mentioned the theme of the book about the military not having anything to do and then coming up with superfluous things, it seems like we're in the opposite mode. The long war is an understatement, and we find the military is perpetually deployed. To me, it echoes really 1984, where there was a continuous series of enemies, some of them concocted for political reasons to keep the country always at war. Any thoughts about that and what that does to civil-military relations?
I think you make a great point. If you look at other countries, I'm thinking of the Falklands-Malvinas War, just off the top of my head. That was a war that was concocted by military leaders to take attention off the economic problems that Argentina was having at the time. But I can see now that the military really does have too much to do, and yet at the same time people want to ask it to do more, because it seems like the only thing that will provide the kinds of tangible results. Because we might intellectually decide that the State Department, for example, might be a more effective tool, or foreign aid. But that doesn't give you a headline that says, Osama bin Laden's just been killed in a military raid. So I think politicians do like to use the military instrument. We may be at the exact reverse of what it was in the coup of 2012, is that while politicians, we get to the same place. Why people look at the military and want to use it, it's for different reasons. Formerly it was because, hey, we're paying all this money, we don't, let's have them do something. Now it's, let's use them because they're the only ones that can give us tangible results. And it's part of the whole short-term thinking in this country. Yes, sir.
General, I wonder if there's any data about breaking out the prestige of very senior officers as compared to the rest of the force. It seems to me that one of the reasons why American people admire the military so much is because it is very professional and educates itself well and holds to a high standard. But the question of what constitutes effective military professionalism becomes murkier in the higher ranks where strategy meets policy, and that seems to be some of the downfalls the military experiences may be taking place at that level. Interestingly, PME stops at the rank of 05 or 06, and then we don't really formally educate anymore. Generals already have all the answers, so they, pardon the expression, so they don't go to school anymore. Is there anything that shows that maybe based on some of the the contretemps that senior officers have been involved in, or just a perception of how well they do their job, that their stature is different from
I don't see
the rest of the military?
I've never seen any scholarship or studies that would break out that very senior. That would be interesting. I can tell you anecdotally, just my personal experiences. A lot of civilians, number one, they don't think a lot of those things are big deals. You don't want to start talking to civilians about adultery being the crime of the century, for a lot of reasons. They don't see it that way. And for example, I was talking to my students about senior officer misconduct, so I went to the current DoD IG quarterly report of senior official misconduct, and they broke out 4 examples. 3 of them had to do with vehicles, meaning, and one of them was, yes, Lieutenant General Umpty Squat drove to the officers club where he's picked up by his aide, and this was in violation of the domicile to duty prohibition. Let me tell you, you throw that out to civilians, they look at you like you have 4 heads. And there is this perception out there that the military disciplinary system is much more draconian than it really is. In fact, the Chief Justice, in an actual opinion, said something about, yes, military justice is rough justice intended to provide for a fighting force. Anybody that's been associated with the military justice system lately, it's not rough justice. It's rough to get done because it's so like the civilian system, with all the impediments that the civilian system has. So, and just my impression is, in terms of the senior officer peccadillos that we've heard about, and even with the General Ward case where he stayed in a hotel room for $1,000 a night or whatever it is, I'm on a campus where we have a basketball coach making $8 million. I don't think they see it the way we do and the way we should see it. We should see it differently because it's more than just staying in a hotel room for $1,000. It's a senior officer breaking the rule, whatever it is. It's like a junior person who uses marijuana. Using marijuana might not be a bad thing in civilian society. It's mainly a bad thing, I think, in our society. It's because we told them not to do it. And it's an affront to authority. That's what makes these little things so important. But in terms of the way the civilians say, yeah, there's going to be a couple bad eggs. But it's so, when you look in, the world that I live, they're looking at Wall Street crooks, they're making hundreds of millions. So I don't think they see it the way we do, as seriously as we do. But it would be interesting to have some scholarship done on that. Dr. Curtis.
Sir, I think your representation of the relationship between American people, the National Guard, and so forth, and the military. I was curious as to whether we can trace some of those changes in perception back to the end of the Vietnam War, when General Craig Navy was actually in rebuilding the Army. They tried to make sure by all of the support being in the Reserves and National Guard and the head of the spirit, the actual troops, essentially that go into war, to essentially his goal was to make sure that we did not go to war again without the American people being involved. Do you think that had some impact upon what you just described?
Well, I don't think that ever really worked, because in the first Gulf War, we went to war pretty much without the Guard. You remember the round out brigades, never really got to the fight. And then the other phenomenon that we have today is that the Guard and Reserve, they don't want those support jobs. They want to be flying fighter jets. They want to be flying bombers. They want to be, infantry. They want to be armored. The reality is that a state governor does not need his own fighter force. He does need a water purification company. He needs military police and so forth. But I don't see that as changing, because You know, the original idea of a guard comes out of, you know, the Constitution. The idea, the original concept of national defense was a very small active duty force to be fleshed out by the militia. And the militia was contemplated at that time to be 500,000, which at the time of the Constitution was just an enormous army. It'd be like a 5 million person army now. But that's not the concept of national defense today, but we still have that vestige, and it's not going to change. We're not going to get rid of the Second Amendment, and we're just going to have to figure out some sort of accommodation, especially, and I don't think that the Guard and the calling up the Guard or reserves would be an impediment these days to the president, you know, using force, mainly because the Guard and the reserves are so integrated with the active duty now. Dr. Basevich.
The anecdote about Eikenberry not getting the job at Northwestern, which I had not heard about, and you cited that as evidence of anti-military sentiment in academia. One possible explanation, you said that his not having a PhD was the nominal
Correct.
explanation. I think you got to consider the possibility that's the actual explanation.
Yeah.
I mean, the world of academia is kind of a close shop. Having a PhD is a union card. If we allow people in who don't have the union B, then they forfeit their control over their profession. And to support that, note that experienced journalists, retired diplomats, retired intelligence professionals also face the same obstacle. These are all people who have a wealth of talent and experience that could enrich higher education, but they too find it very difficult to get jobs as full-time professors. Why? Because they don't have the union.
I think that's a tremendously important point. I hope people listen to it very carefully. It's actually a three-beer conversation to talk about the problems with higher education in this country, and the fact that it doesn't always value the practical experience. It's ironic because the students, especially as they get closer to actually graduating, tend to glom on to people of actual practical experience, because they get to the point where they know the theory pretty well, but they're at the point where they want to know, okay, what words are supposed to come out of my mouth? And how do I actually get that appointment? And how do I conduct myself? And things like this. But it is a fact. And I do think that in the Northwestern case, I only know what I read in the newspapers. They did have a quote from the guy that they put out from the faculty council. He says, we don't want to be associated with the military and America's foreign policy. Okay, well, Northwestern, you're in the United States, but be that as it may. But I would suspect that there are a lot of professors who voted for it, voted against it, who it was simply because of the absence of the union card. And we might want to think about that in terms of, are we missing an opportunity in a world where we know that, you know, the military is getting smaller and smaller, people don't know as much about it. Are we missing an opportunity in higher education to have the value of having someone who has served not just in the military, but also in government, to provide that sort of perspective in addition to the purely academic aspect of it? I actually have a lot of respect for the pure academics. And there really is a place for them, because they do write very often they will write the books, they build the intellectual infrastructure. I wrote an article not too long ago about, it's called Clever or Clueless. It's about academics and bombing debates. And the point I made is that academics have a lot to contribute, but they have to learn about how airplanes work, how bombs work. You know, they can tell you the notes memoir from the 1905 convention or whatever, but they don't know how. I still go to conferences now talking about carpet bombing. Yes, you're carpet bombing everywhere. I'm sort of the pro-drone guy in a lot of things, and I went to this one panel at a major university, and my opposite was there saying, yes, drones, they're roaming the earth, killing whoever they want, and you know. And then finally I said, you do know there's a pilot, right? You know, there's a pilot, it's remote, you know, but, And he goes, "That's what you say." To the great credit of the young people of the United States of America, the students burst into laughter at that one. And he did not take it well either. I can tell you, because we had to go out to dinner afterwards, and it was awkward, but enjoyable from my perspective.
Thank you for your talk. That last comment transitions well to my question. I did a dissertation on moral injury, moral formation of warfighters. Military personnel start off as civilians, they become military personnel, and most of them retire again as civilians. How do civilians do, in your mind, in preparing our boys and girls to become the men and women who fight our wars? And then how do we do in receiving them back home and giving them a place to unpack their moral experiences, to transition back to civilian life, all of that?
Well, I think Phil Carr would be able to tell you a lot better about that, maybe in the next panel, because he is like Mr. Veteran. But just from my perspective, and this is follow up on something Dr. Basevich had, like in my experience at Duke in academia, I've never really had any overt anti-militarism, for example. I had, that's not the same thing as full acceptance by the true academics. They look at you differently, and they. I remember when I was on active duty, I went to a certain elite university in Boston. Used to always make them take me to the faculty club in my uniform, and I never got any negatives because it was almost a little bit of parting the waters, because I think they thought, military guy, we don't know anything about. Maybe he's going to go postal on us here. Stay out of his way. I do think that the problem, just from my perspective, and Phil's forgotten more about this subject than I ever knew, my perspective is that I think people make assumptions about veterans now, that they all have PTSD, that they all have problems, that, gosh, we love them, and they made this sacrifice, but wow, there's something wrong with them, and it's just a matter of time before it comes out. I think that makes it hard for veterans to adjust. I also remember there was a veteran that came down and opened a coffee shop in Durham, and he got a lot of press for it, and the business failed. And I went down there a couple times, and not very receptive. I was going to link him up with like people from the business school and all. There are people, civilians want to help. This is why I think it's terribly bad when you hear serving people or veterans, when they mock civilians who thank them for their service. Hey, they don't know how to interface with you. They're just doing the best they can. They want to thank you. Take it. Don't mock them for it and read all these other things into it. They're doing the best that they can. I do think that I'm a little bit of the perspective that there is a category of veterans that needs a lot of help, but the general veterans, they're good, they're fine, and that we can be stigmatized inadvertently by people who want to be helpful, and I think that those who do have the moral injury, who are trying to sort it out, would be better off not labeled as this damaged person, but rather as a normal person who, I can tell you, there are people in business who've made decisions that haunt them, or in all aspects of life. I think it's a general thing in our population that I was really initially hostile to the whole idea of moral injury because I thought it was bogus. But the more you look into it, the more there is something there, and I think it is more than just a military veterans issue. It's as people go through life, they make decisions that they do regret, they know are wrong. You do have to go on with your life. So how do you put that back together and move forward? And so I think it's a broader problem than that. I think maybe time for one more. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your talk. I found it very interesting. I'm from Western University when I came from Montreal. I just have.
I'm sorry, I'm about half deaf. This is.
Sorry. I'm Jessica Wolfenbell from West Virginia University.
Oh, okay.
I was a hardcore.
I could tell by your accent you're from West Virginia.
So I wondered whether, well, two things. One, whether the concern about academic hostility might be somewhat
I think you're onto a number of things. Number one, I think that generally today, ROTC is fine. I threw up those slides just to I'm trying to look forward, and I'm just starting to see the first little timber of noise, and just kind of a warning order. I also think that you have a point that there is a perception, people assume that you're socially conservative. People assume you're hostile to LGBT. People assume you're hostile to women in combat. And all that may be true of people of a certain age, more my age, but much less so with the typical person in the armed forces. The typical person in the armed forces, I think, is like 27 years old. And they're not as socially conservative. I don't care what, the Military Times comes out with these polls. You know what those polls are? Those polls are anybody who wants to decide, hey, I'm in favor of Trump. They just came out. I don't take any opinion on any candidate, but I would not rely on those polls, because I think that the military is much more, it is generally probably more to the right than the general public, but it's not as extreme as people might think. So I do think that part of the problem is that people don't know people in the military, so they have their own stereotypes, and some people in the military have stereotypes of people on the outside. For example, there is this idea in the military, hey, we're better, smarter than everybody else. But I use as an example Bill Gates. There's no way in God's green earth that Bill Gates or the Apple guy, Jobs, would have ever made it in the military. But they are more important. They've been more important to our society and the kind of free enterprise system that we have than millions of other people. In fact, if you read Jobs' book, it's almost like a primer on exactly the opposite of what the military teaches you about leadership. I mean, he did everything exactly the opposite. And Bill Gates, if you look at when he was younger, there's no way he would have made it. So I think that there are stereotypes on both sides, and what we need to do is work to diminish them. That's why I would like to see more people in civilian academia who have experience in government and or the military. And at the same time, there's opportunities for civilian academia to get, contact with the military and get familiar with them, because I really do think that is the real solution to civil-military relations. And I think if people get to understand each other more, then that's the way forward. Well, I think I've overstayed my stay, but thank you so much.
On behalf of the Stockdale Center, please accept this small token of our appreciation, and thank you for sharing your unique and important perspective.
Thank you so much.